48 hours ago, the nation awoke to a political earthquake. No one under 45 has ever voted in an election that took the Downing Street keys from the Conservatives and handed them to Labour. But politics is a brutal business. Just days ago, Rishi Sunak was the leader of one of the most powerful nations on earth. This morning, he is all but invisible, and all eyes are on his successor. Keir Starmer didn't waste a moment. By this time yesterday, his top team had assembled for their marching orders. They left by the front door. Meanwhile, at the back door, the previous occupants of number 10 were making a quiet exit. Boring! Boring! Across town, the real architect of the Tory defeat got his seat. And he just doesn't do quiet. Hold on to your hats. Jonathan Reynolds is the new Business and Trade Secretary, with a pivotal role in delivering the new government's key mission of economic growth. We'll look at the party's mandate for change and some timely advice from a previous Labour Prime Minister. For the Conservatives, it's opposition following a devastating election result. It's hard to tell exactly how the party will rebuild as potential leaders wait to emerge. We'll be joined by Tory big beast and former Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi. Just how far could the new Prime Minister go in forming a closer relationship with the EU? The Irish Prime Minister tells this programme there would be a fair hearing for any proposals from Keir Starmer. We'll bring you that interview with Simon Harris. One of the biggest stories of the election was the collapse of the SNP. They lost dozens of seats in Scotland. One of the most prominent to go was Joanna. We'll talk about why it happened and what it means for independence. Plus, with us throughout the show, the former Labour advisor and Keir Starmer's biographer, Tom Baldwin, the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, and the chief executive of the foreign affairs think tank, Chatham House. That's Bronwyn Maddox. Welcome to Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. In a year when elections elsewhere seem dominated by extremism and violence, Britain's democracy remains defiantly devoid of melodrama. And in my view, all the better for that. We'll see in time if Keir Starmer can make a better fist of the enormous challenges facing our nation than his predecessor: the cost of living, an ageing, more diverse population, climate change, war in Europe. Take nothing away from the scale of Labour's victory. It was huge. But what took place on Thursday was no revolution. Yes, we chose the toolmaker's son over the pharmacist's boy. But the ousted Prime Minister didn't complain that the election had been stolen. In a notably gracious resignation speech, he called his conqueror a decent man who he respects. The victor returned the compliment, reminding us that Rishi Sunak would go down in history as our first ethnic minority leader. Perhaps we're on the verge of a return to something we used to prize in politics: civility. We might start to talk about some of those big issues rather than dwelling on internal party psychodramas. I may even persuade someone on this programme to give an answer that's actually related to the question I've asked. Come on, even journalists can dream. Let's give it a go. A little earlier, I spoke to the new Business and Trade Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. Secretary of State, and before I go anywhere else with this interview, how does that sound? Secretary of State?
It's the first time I've had that in an interview, and it does feel very special on a personal level to have had that experience of being asked to walk up Downing Street, to go into an office that used to belong to Winston Churchill in the old Admiralty, the Department of Business and Trade. Really, really personally significant. But obviously the most exciting bit is to be able to get on with the job and deliver on the mandate that we've received.
Indeed, and the last but one Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair, doesn't waste any time in telling you how you should get on with the job. His top thing, I gather, is that he says that you need a plan for migration. And that implies that he thinks you don't actually have one. And that because you don't have one, you risk the rise of the national populists. That's a rather stinging assessment of the Labour campaign, isn't it?
Well, look, I think he mentions immigration once in a 1,500-word article, but the policies we put forward in the election are, I think, what the country needs. It's not just about tackling illegal immigration, important as that is. We've got to look at legal migration. We've got to look at the relationship to the skills system. Why, for instance, have there been jobs on the shortage occupations list now for 15 years or since the list came into existence? You know, the sense of it not responding to real market conditions, relying too much on immigration, even though I will always welcome people who want to come to contribute to the UK. Changes to the apprenticeship levy that we put forward. We have a plan for that, and it's about a much closer linkage between migration.
Well, that's interesting, because he's pretty clear that he doesn't seem to think you have one. In a typical sort of Blair phrase, he says, if you don't have rules, you will have prejudices. And what that implies, that he thinks you haven't actually laid out any rules. You might have projects, but you don't have rules. And the point I think he's making is Labour has to get a grip on legal migration numbers, and he wants to see what you're going to do about that. What is it? Would you, for example, back his call for ID cards?
Well, the new Home Secretary will be looking at all sources of advice when it comes to that. But I would just say we have backed the points-based immigration system. We made difficult decisions, particularly when we thought legal migration was too high. I think it has to come down. Again, I'll say that whilst always welcoming people who do make a contribution, come to the UK to do that. I think it's historically high at a time when public services were under strain, and I think it's right to recognise public concern around that. But look, we made decisions, not just in the campaign, but before it, about backing, at times, decisions, particularly on dependence, which were not easy decisions. So we have been doing that. We'll continue to do that, and we want to address those issues.
But what's clear from what you've just said is that you haven't made a decision, but digital ID cards are on the table as one possibility.
Well, look, my colleague Yvette Cooper and the rest of the Home Affairs team will be looking at all sources of things. I'm not going to preempt things they may or may not want to do, but I would push back on the assertion that we've not made already significant political decisions, recognising public concern on legal migration, recognising the system has to work better, but looking at the real answers, not gimmicks, as we saw from the previous government. And I'll respect my colleagues taking that agenda forward.
OK, well, let me put it to you in a slightly different way. Everybody respects Tony Blair, but is this intervention a little bit unhelpful in the first 48 hours?
Well, I don't think anything is unhelpful. Of course, when you are an incoming government, you're always looking to people who have, frankly, done a job in the past in government. Their expertise, their experience will be invaluable. It's not about harking back to any era, but of course, if people have been in something that resembles a similar position to this incoming government, we'll listen to them, of course we will.
Well, you say not harking back to another era. It's striking this morning that there are a couple of new appointments, both of which are pure Blairite era. Jackie Smith, who was at Home Secretary and was a Blair minister for a long time, and Alan Milburn, actually, who was Blair Health Secretary, both back in one way or another in government. Well,
this is a cabinet which has won a mandate in its own right, has its own set of people that knows what its own agenda is, and actually, in historical terms, actually groundbreaking in some of the representation now we're seeing at the top table of British government. Of course, we will use expertise, experience where it is available. I think specifically on Alan Milburn, I know he's been working with the health team. I think no announcement has been made around that. But of course, people like Jackie Smith and the experience that they bring, there are a lot of problems for an incoming government to resolve. If people can give us advice, know how the system works, of course, any cabinet member is going to be looking at how they can do that.
All right, well, another piece of advice he gives you is, he's not clear about it, but he's pretty strongly hints that there should be a closer relationship with the EU. The Irish Prime Minister, Simon Harris, suggests to Sky News this morning that this could be the start of a new relationship. I just want to show you what he says.
Brexit has happened. The people of Britain have made that decision. But absolutely, is there space to have a veterinary agreement? Is there space in terms of student mobility? Is there space to work closer together on issues? I think there absolutely is. And I do think there would be a willingness in Europe to have those conversations in due course, should that be the wish of the British government.
That seems to me a pretty clear opening of the door to a renegotiation of at least some aspects of the trade deal. Are you going to walk through that door? It's your job now.
Well, I welcome that constructive attitude from colleagues. We were right in the campaign to respect Brexit, to not revisit those constitutional arguments. But when it comes to trade, the issue that you've just revealed there in that revealing clip is really about standards on food. We've got the same standards as the European Union. If we can sell more whiskey, more salmon to a market which is so significant to us, of course we should explore an opportunity like that. And I think moving forward to be frank, a relationship to Europe that is not determined by the internal politics of the Conservative Party is very much in the national interest in the UK. So we're not going to revisit those constitutional arguments, but of course where it's in the mutual interests of both the European Union and the UK to work together, that good faith relationship has got to make sense.
So no re-entry to the EU, no new referendums or anything like that, but it's clear you want a closer relationship with the EU.
Well, I think on things like food and agricultural products agreement, where we've got the same standards, removing some of those barriers to trade, that makes sense. We have talked, for instance, about recognising each other's professional qualifications, again, completely sensible, pragmatic. You know, if you are in the creative industries, you've really suffered in your ability to move around the European Union in terms of the restrictions on that. These are practical things. And actually, we have seen a little bit under the last government. We saw the reassociation with Horizon, the science agreement, and the Windsor framework. So clearly, the basis is there to do that. And I welcome constructive colleagues.
It's interesting because you've named 3 or 4 things there. And put together, this sounds like the development of a new deal. I mean, to some extent, what Rishi Sunak tried to do, but actually you seem to be saying that there is space here for a new and more open relationship with the EU. They're going to ask for something. They're going to ask for migration. Are you open to that? Free movement of people?
Well, I don't think we should preempt that negotiation. We're not open to the free movement of people. That is something which is part of membership of the European Union. And as I said, we're not revisiting that. So it's not about that. Let's be clear as well. These are things that I think are in the UK's interest. They're also in the EU's interest. That doesn't mean it's an easy negotiation. But of course, we should always be seeking to make those opportunities real for everyone across the UK.
All right. What happened on Thursday was in many ways historic, records broken all over the place. But some of it is also personal. Can I ask about one of your former shadow cabinet colleagues, Jonathan Ashworth, who I think, actually, I've interviewed on Sunday morning to even more times than you. Did you feel his absence at yesterday's first cabinet meeting? Because he lost his seat, surprisingly.
I did. I've known Jonathan a long time. He put in a credible service to the campaign, maybe to his own personal cost in that way. And, of course, to be in a political system where you can win a landslide, get that mandate, but lose very close colleagues, that is, British politics is tough. Like that, on a personal level, really, you know, someone who'd given so much and has a lot to give, and I hope we can find a role that will allow him to continue to do that.
One of the reasons I ask is that he lost his seat in Leicester South. We don't know yet, but it is thought partly because of, if you like, some ethnic rivalries, which is something that's popped up elsewhere within the Labour campaign. And in some Birmingham seats, the Labour vote was depressed, particularly in places where there's a large Muslim population. Is this going to be an issue for Labour?
Well, look, we would take the loss of any support seriously. You know, of course, there's a lot to digest from a set of results where I don't think we've ever really had a general election quite like it in terms of the diversity of contests across every bit of the UK. So, of course, there's a lot to digest from that, take on. I would say we will always, as Keir made clear, the new Prime Minister made clear, we will always put country first, party second. Sometimes there are tough things.
But you were hit by the Gaza protests, basically.
Look, I really understand people's frustration. There are particularly younger people in Britain, not just confined to one community, by the way. This is across the board. They've never seen a real peace process in the Middle East. They're frustrated. They see, you know, the difficulties that causes, real problems on both sides, incredible human suffering. Of course, they're frustrated by that. What I hope we can now do as a government is show real leadership on the world stage to a real solution to that conflict. Now, I think, to be honest, people want... They want to see that progress rather than the words behind it. And I do understand that and think we can contribute to that.
The other thing that's happened, of course, is that you've made these appointments. Prime Minister brought in experts like Sir Patrick Vallance. But as I said, we're seeing the return of some veterans, let's call it, from the Blair era, Jackie Smith, Alan Milburn. How can I put this delicately? Prime Minister had 411 MPs to choose from. are none of them good enough to do these jobs?
No, it's not about that. I mean, look, I think my generation of Labour MPs can hold our heads high in terms of returning Labour to power and what has happened, particularly in the last Parliament when people of my intake and age, came to the fore in the shadow cabinet as it then was. But we're very much aware that if you can bring in experience of government, if you know people who can make a difference. Douglas Alexander will join my team, for instance, as the Trade Minister.
The former Brown Minister.
Incredible expertise, incredible career outside of Parliament since he left after what happened in that election. Of course, you want to use that. And I think, actually, that's a sign of strength that you can bring in that kind of expertise and the confidence you've got to do that.
All right, let's talk about strength. You start with this thumping majority, which is, you would say, is your mandate for change. But let's remember, 2/3 of the voters did not choose you. Does that really give you the authority to impose what the minority that backed you want on the majority? And let me just make it very specific. The MPs that support your government got less than 24,000 votes for each seat. Yet it took 500,000 votes to elect a Green MP, over 800,000 to elect a Reform MP. Is that really a fair system?
Well, first of all, Labour has a clear mandate. The first political party in a generation...
You've got a lot of MPs. You've got 2/3 of the MPs elected with 1/3 of the votes.
The first political party in a generation to win a majority of seats in England, Wales and Scotland. That is no small achievement. Our system is about seats. I've been here after elections where we can say, we piled up votes in a small number of places. That's not how British general elections work. I think it's really important to say that, there are results in the past that are similar to this. I don't think you can say a system is unfair just because one side wins it. And this was our strategy.
The fact that it was unfair in the past doesn't make it any better that it's unfair now.
But let's just be clear, Labour has a mandate to govern. There can be no questions around that. I would also say, when it comes to parties like Reform and the Green Party, they do get far less scrutiny because they're not seen as parties of government or going to elect significant numbers. Now, maybe that should change. I think that's something to address. I met a lot of good people in this campaign who told me they were voting Reform. When you explain to them they support in Reform the economic policies of Liz Truss and the foreign policies of Vladimir Putin, they're horrified. So, now they're in Parliament, they'll get the level of scrutiny they deserve.
Yeah, but look, I'm not being partisan. I don't want to be partisan here. This is an issue about democracy. Let me show you this chart. And I think most fair-minded people would ask themselves, is this really right? You got 33.7% of the votes, not far off what you got last time. Less than you got under Corbyn when you got spanked. But you got 2/3 nearly of the seats. The Lib Dems down there, they are more or less okay. But Reform and the Greens, not less than 1% of the seats, but Reform, 1 in 7 votes. Greens, 7%. I'm just asking you really, as a Democrat, rather than as a government minister, is that really sustainable?
Look, I have talked in the past about my own views on this sort of thing, but I would say when you've got a system, you run your campaign to win under that system. Now, you can't then look at it through a different lens. We have had elections in the past where Labour has had these extraordinary majorities in a small number of places. That's not good enough. We are not a party of protest, or you can't look at vote share, especially when people vote tactically. That's part of the system under first past the post. We had to get a mandate to govern to replace this former failing Conservative government. We've done that, and I think you've got to recognise that the campaign will reflect the system required to get that mandate to win.
Let me put you something that's happening right across Europe, and that is, in a way, the advance of what people call nationalist populism. Let me ask you first question specifically about Labour. How did it feel to be indebted to Nigel Farage for the size of your victory? Because this only happened, really, because he divided the vote and the right.
No, again, I reject that. I think the idea that somehow, if the Conservative Party, with its record, would simply have seen votes transfer automatically to Labour as the alternative. That isn't how it happens. Labour had to earn the right to be the party that could win this election. And that was not something that happened by accident. It happened with Keir Starmer's leadership. So the idea that someone else is the active agent in that happening, I'm sorry, no. It is down to Labour and being a party willing to acknowledge its defeat.
We'll argue the toss about the numbers, but I just wanted to ask you lastly about something that's happening today, which is, I think, relevant. Tonight, Marine Le Pen will probably become the leader of the largest party in France's parliament, with a bigger share of the vote in France and you won here. Are you looking forward to negotiating with a new trade relationship with France, with the EU, under Madame Le Pen's leadership?
Well, I'm going to say any election in France is down to the people of France to decide that. I would say more generally, it's wrong to think of trade relationships and trade treaties in particular as being with the political leadership at any one time
but it
of a
must make
country,
a difference.
whether that is in France, whether that is in the USA. Those are long-term relationships that outlive, if you do them properly, whoever is in charge at any one moment. It's about two countries, not sets of political leaders, and the long-term national interest will always be what we're putting forward in trade policy from a new Labour government.
OK, Secretary of State for Business and Trade, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let's see what our panel made of all that. We're joined all morning by the former Labour advisor and Keir Starmer's biographer, Tom Baldwin, the editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, and the chief executive of Chatham House, Bronwyn Maddox. Tom, Tony Blair's intervention this morning can't keep him out of the papers, can you? Was it helpful?
I think it's probably intended as helpful and it'll be taken as such. Look, Tony Blair knows quite a lot about winning elections. He's part of that now very exclusive club, slightly less exclusive club than before. There used to be just 3 Labour leaders who'd won elections. Now there's 4. Keir Starmer. So his advice is important and it'll be well received. And
But it could be given privately, couldn't it?
Look, what he's describing is what everyone knows. That this election, which has given Labour a huge majority, has also churned up the electoral battlefield. And there are new challenges facing Keir Starmer now. Right? You're having to fight on a number of different fronts. You're having to fight a populist far right with Nigel Farage, a phenomenon we're seeing right across Europe and in America too. You're having to fight on the left flank on issues including Gaza. You're having to fight probably in new territory in the Blue Wall when you're bringing in planning reforms and you've got a lot of Labour MPs.
The Blue Wall being southern constituencies of slightly middle class, slightly countryside-y type people.
And you're bringing in planning reforms in order to get the growth was absolutely essential, but you're going to come up against opposition there. And so this is a sort of game of 3-dimensional chess you've got to play, and it's going to be really difficult. And if Keir Starmer is going to turn this gigantic sandcastle of the parliamentary majority he's got into something more concrete, he's going to need advice from people who know how to win elections like Tony Blair.
Fraser, the phrase sandcastle comes from the pollster James Kanagasuriam, who coined Red Wall. Is this Labour majority built on sand, or is it here for a while?
Certainly no party in our democratic history has got so many seats from so few votes. When you look at the vote share, this is the least popular government we've had pretty much since the introduction of universal franchise. But then again, you've got to take tactical voting. I see this as basically a Labour majority built on exasperation with the Conservatives. I think Keir Starmer's opportunity is to turn this into a genuinely pro-Labour majority as opposed to an anti-Tory majority. He can do that by achievement. And so far, I have to say, it's pretty encouraging. Look at Wes Streeting. Straight out the traps, the first few hours in the job, he declares the NHS to be broken and needing reform, getting in Alan Milburn, a proven NHS reformer, as his advisor. And so we see, and then also, to me, the most fascinating appointment, I think, is James Timpson, the head of Timpson's. He's a guy who's a proven reformer in prisons. He believes that 1/3 of prisoners shouldn't really be there at all. He's coming in as prison minister. So these are people who want to make change. Now, Keir Starmer probably would have wanted to do change in his second term, all things being equal. But when you look at this election results, this shows an electorate never have so few people placed their faith in one of the 2 main parties. So the anti-Tory anger could turn into anti-Labour anger in a second unless you manage to deliver. That means doing a whole bunch of unpopular things early on and using this huge majority into genuinely an agenda for change.
So there's an interesting picture, Bronwyn, isn't it? How long is the honeymoon going to last? Monday morning?
Monday morning. And they were right to get going on Saturday, just as soon as Keir Starmer had appointed his cabinet. They know, and this is the source, I think, of the unease hanging over these celebrations. They know that this was a really unusual election result. 2/3 share of the seats are based on 1/3 share of the votes, roughly. And Tony Blair has put his finger on some of the problems, many of the problems, but that's not hard to do. I think Keir Starmer and his team are right across that. The question is the solutions. And I was not entirely convinced by Tony Blair's big solution at the end, which is to turn to AI in the public sector, in the private sector, and get AI to run government departments much more cheaply. If only there were a magic wand like that. As Keir Starmer's team knows, this is a slog beginning on Monday, if not now, beginning with the NHS, but then they want growth. And yet they're stuck, as that chart shows. The big source of growth might well be the EU, but anything they do on the EU begins to sound like freedom of movement. I was really interested that Jonathan Reynolds didn't get close to mentioning the deal that the EU would like on freedom of movement for 18 to 30-year-olds, really popular with young people, didn't get close to it because it sounds like freedom of movement again.
One of the things that Keir Starmer's advisors have been studying really closely in the last few weeks is the experience of other centre and centre-left governments around the world. And I think that Joe Biden's administration, when it came in, made a mistake by appearing too soft on immigration. And that has then undercut efforts they've made subsequently to toughen their stance. I think that Schulz's government in Germany probably made a mistake in turning net zero into a green issue rather than an issue about energy security. So they are looking at how governments perhaps similar in sort of political outlook to Keir Starmer's can better weather these sort of populist storms than some of those around the world.
Well, actually, on the question of migration, Blair, as always, has a phrase for it. If you don't have rules, then you end up with prejudice, which I suspect we're going to hear a lot of over the next period. Do you think, Fraser, that this government's going to get a grip of this?
Of course, and this is happening already. I mean, net immigration is coming down very, very quickly, and that's because the last Conservative government slammed the emergency brakes on the visa and the conditions. They tightened them up. So there's a couple of things that Keir Starmer is going to be able to point to because they're baked in already. One is NHS waiting lists. They're going to be coming down very quickly by December. That's the forecast. The same with net migration is going to be coming down very quickly. Living standards are going to be rising because inflation is forecast to stay at 2% for a long time. So these are three kind of achievements which will have been done by Tory reforms, which he will now get the credit for. Now, that's politics, but I think we actually genuinely have taken back control of immigration rules. If the Conservative governments will change the visa things and Labour tighten them even more, of course it can be as low as you realistically want. So I think that will come to be seen as one of Keir Starmer's great achievements, even though it won't be him. But there are rules aplenty, and for the first time in about 40 or 50 years, the UK government has got complete control of those immigration rules.
Do you think, hearing the tone in Simon Harris's interview, what do you think the EU's body language is going to be towards this new government? Are they going to be warmer, given that, of course, elsewhere on the continent, the political direction is exactly away from the centre-left?
It's going to be very smiley, but that doesn't mean that it's very different in substance. And even though you say, many countries in Europe appear to be tilting right, that is because of the same pressures on immigration that Britain is facing, that the US is facing, that pretty well every richer country is facing, whether it's because of people's aspiration or fear or flight from war and hunger. So I don't think those pressures are going to go away. The last government did do a couple of things that were effective, particularly saying students couldn't bring their families, which produced a very rapid drop in immigrants from India and Nigeria, as we've begun to see in university figures. But it's a really, really difficult problem, and I don't think there's a single solution. Again, I don't bring Tony Blair too much into it, but one of his technical solutions, again, to how this might solve a big problem, was
digital ID.
Digital ID. And I can see that Labour might be tempted by that, feeling
That's a really good point here, because identity cards were Blair's obsession last time in government. Now, of course, right now he's a businessman. British politics has never had somebody as powerful and with as much money as the Tony Blair Institute. And right now, I imagine a great number of his colleagues will be making their way as special advisors into the Labour government. That's going to be the real Blair influence. We'll find out how many. Eventually, I suspect we're not told. But right now, if you look at who's funding Blair, his backers in the digital ID industry are wanting him to advance this policy, and he's doing it straight away.
What exactly would you call his business?
We'll come back to all of this, and also I want to ask Tom about Farage, but it is just after 9 o'clock. You're watching Sunday Morning with Trevor Phillips. The Business Secretary has told this programme that Labour does have a plan on immigration, following an intervention by Tony Blair that the government needs a plan. Jonathan Reynolds said he welcomed the words of the Irish Prime Minister that any proposals from Keir Starmer for renegotiations with the EU would receive a fair hearing. Well, there's plenty to stick around for this morning, and shortly we'll turn to the future of the Conservative Party and speak to the former Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi. Then we'll reflect on the extraordinary election with one of the country's leading pollsters, Ipsos Chief Executive, Ben Page. And we'll look at the decimation of the SNP at Westminster with one of their defeated former MPs, Joanna. Plus, we'll hear from the Taoiseach, Simon Harris, who has warm words for Keir Starmer over a possible closer relationship with the EU. Well, Conservatives here are often described as the most successful political party in the democratic world, holding power for much of the last 150 years. Now they sit in opposition after a devastating result. Their share of the vote nationally down to less than 24%. They're left with just 121 members of parliament. Well, it's a natural part of our system that governments are slung out after a long time in power, but to many this feels a period of existential threat, as millions of voters abandon the party to left and to right. So how does it regroup, and what will the party look like in years to come? Well, I'm joined now by a Tory big beast and the former Chancellor, Nadhim Zahawi. Good morning.
Good morning, Trevor.
Former Chancellor, I suppose I've got to call you now. Look, you lost.
Yes, we did.
Is this an extinction-level event for the Tories?
It is pretty catastrophic. To go from 365 MPs down to 121 is pretty shocking. But I do think that we have an opportunity to regroup. Why do I say that? Because I think if you look at the MPs that remain today, we've got some serious talent in the Conservative Party that is still in Parliament. And I am hopeful that they will come together, because for too many years, for far too long, we formed a circular firing squad. And that is what the electorate saw, and therefore they reacted, and they reacted quite rightly by throwing us out of power.
You announced many months ago that you were leaving the House of Commons, but perhaps it's an indication of how shattering a blow this is for your party, that not a single senior serving member of the Conservative Party, parliamentary party, would volunteer to speak for the party this morning. That I don't think I've ever remembered being in a situation where a senior, no senior person wanted to come on the telly.
A couple of things. One, they're probably exhausted, and I don't think you would...
Nobody's ever too exhausted to take 10 minutes
I hear you, but
in front of an audience.
If you've been running a campaign to get re-elected, as Jeremy Hunt has been able to do, and I congratulate him on an excellent campaign. He stayed in his constituency. It was really a massive endorsement of his performance as a member of Parliament, and that's at the end of the day what we all are. Well,
steady on. He scraped home. And by the way, he, for example, has already said he's not running for the leadership. And but it's striking, you know. OK, Penny Mordaunt's out. She's not saying anything. All the people who we think of as potential leaders, Badenoch, Tugendhat, Braverman and so on, all silent this morning. What's going on?
But it is Sunday morning after a bruising Thursday and Friday.
Yeah, I mean, basically, with a lot of these people, we had to actually lock the doors to stop them coming in the studio. What's going on?
Well, I'll tell you what, I suspect the very senior ones are working out whether they're going to run or not for the leadership. If they are going to run, they'll be putting their teams together over the weekend. On, I think, Monday, the party board will meet. Of course, then the 1922 has to be reconstituted. A new chairman of the 1922 will have to be elected.
Because Graham Brady
obviously
stood down.
So there's a lot going on. And forgive me, I know your show is incredibly important, as you
It's part of the Constitution.
You came to me last night, and quite rightly, I said I would come on the programme.
Okay.
So I wouldn't read too much into why you couldn't get anyone senior, because you remember they've been fighting their seats, and they're now having to sort of sit back and think about what they do next.
All right. Look, nobody's watching, so we can speak privately. Who would you like to see as the next leader? I would have thought, for example, you might be a Cleverly man.
Well, at this stage, I think the most important thing, whoever comes forward, is they come forward with a plan of how to unite the party, bring us back together. As I say, I think the biggest challenge for us is unity. And I think the lesson, if we haven't learnt it yet, then we really will be in trouble, is that we have to present a united front to the country. Rishi suffered badly in the campaign because there were sort of voices from his own party coming out against whether it's the campaign or pre-campaign. Before him, you know what happened, right, with Boris.
Well, that's interesting.
So I think in many ways our greatest challenge now is how do we unite the party? We've always had those who were centre-left and centre-right.
This is very interesting because it feels to me like that rules out certain people. So, for example, Suella Braverman, who decided to go into the newspapers the day before the vote to say how rubbish the campaign had been. If you think about uniting and all the rest of it, doesn't feel like it to me. There are other candidates. People talk about Kemi Badenoch as somebody who can start a fight in an empty room. It sounds like you're already narrowing down the potential list of candidates here.
You are trying very hard to get me to come out and either criticise or attack my colleagues. I'm not going to do that.
Okay, I'll ask
today.
you a serious question about this. What? Let's not name names, but what does the next leader of the Conservative Party, from your point of view, look like? What are the qualities that person's going to have?
So that's the right question to ask. Why do I say that? Because if you look at what has just happened, and interestingly enough, in your earlier discussion with Jonathan Reynolds, Tony Blair wasn't the first to home in on the immigration issue. It was Alistair Campbell on the night, because I was with him on another station on election night, and he asked the question immediately of both Rachel Reeves and the new Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, because unless they have a plan for migration as a whole, you are going to see Labour come under huge pressure, especially in those red wall seats. You look at where reform were heading, and it's easy to have a sort of simplistic answer to this by someone like Nigel Farage, but it's potent. Now, what are the lessons for us? We've got to draw lessons from what we've done well. So if you look at the pandemic, the vaccine deployment, that went well. Why did it go well? It wasn't just, and I take very little credit for this. It's my team, but also more importantly, bringing outside expertise. What Starmer's done well is James Timpson, Patrick Vallance, bringing outside expertise to help deal with some of these big issues. How is he going to deal with immigration will be a huge test for him.
Okay, so that's one of the answers. Look, there's going to be a spectre at the Tory feast, and that spectre is called Nigel Farage. The new father of the House, the longest-serving MP, Edward Lee, said yesterday that you should appeal to reform voters and that you should bring Nigel Farage into the party. Now, when you were last in this studio, you said, not a chance. But after Thursday's results, they took 14.3% of the vote. They essentially deprived the Tories of a majority. Have you changed your mind?
No, I tell you what we need to do is appeal to reform voters and to Lib Dem voters. Let's not forget that, yes, of course, the reason for the Labour majority is reform doing so well in England especially. Labour's vote went backwards in Wales, yet they've got this massive majority. The other reason, of course, they had a great campaign in Scotland under Anna Sawar and the SNP collapse. But we need to appeal to the... Remember, Lib Dems got 72 seats.
Yeah.
They've taken many, many seats from us, including my own in Stratford-on-Avon. So this idea that if all we need to do is deal with the issues around reform, for immigration, migration, is not enough. I think we have to do both. We have to be able to appeal to Stratfordians and say, come back to us. Here's why. Here's why we deserve your vote. And the Red Wall seats to say, we will have dealt with immigration and Labour can't.
All right, we can see the contours of the argument that's going to take place in the Conservative Party. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Great to see you.
Well, I am sure there's going to be plenty of talk about the future of the Conservatives in coming weeks and months, and that, along with everything else at this historic moment, will be on the agenda on Politics at Jack and Sam's podcast, which is out every Sunday, looking to the week ahead. You can scan the QR code on your screen now to listen and subscribe. It's free wherever you get your podcasts. Well, let's reflect on that extraordinary election from a few days ago now and try to understand what it means in our politics. I'm joined now by an old friend, the Chief Executive of Pollsters Ipsos Ben Page. Ben, we have been having this conversation for more time than any of us would like to...
Decades.
How big a deal is what happened on Thursday?
Well, I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Particularly that the Conservatives go to their lowest ever number of seats since, 1906. I mean, that is astonishing at one level. The Reform Party getting more votes than the Liberal Democrats, but only getting 5 MPs. So it's shown the vagaries of our system. But at the same time, I actually think it's the result in terms of a large Labour majority is what most people in this country actually wanted. And I would say that by saying, if you look at, OK, only 33.7% of the registered voters voted Labour, but basically it was an election about kicking the Conservatives out.
Right.
And if you look at the fundamentals, on every single policy area, when you ask the British public, whose policies do you prefer, Labour's or the Conservatives, on every single one, except defence, Labour were clearly ahead. And in a toss-up between the two main candidates for Prime Minister, Starmer and Sunak, we had 46% of the population, so far more than actually registered voters voting for him, saying Starmer would be the best Prime Minister, and only 21% for Sunak. So I think, on balance, the system, it has many flaws. The reason there aren't massive riots in the streets is, unlike in France, is that it's broadly giving people what they were hoping for, which is change, which over 7 out of 10 people said they wanted to see.
I want to come back to ask you about France in a second, but let's just stick with this country for a moment. One of the things that I think will govern Keir Starmer's actions will be how solid he thinks that base is. Now, there's this idea, this phrase now emerging of the sandcastle majority. It's big, wide, but it could be washed away very quickly. How constrained do you think he's going to be by that?
To be honest, I don't think so, because his only chance of now securing another term is, of course, to deliver change, to improve public services. He's going to have to make some very tough decisions. They will not be popular with everybody in his own party. They won't be necessarily popular among the opposition. But he's going to have to do that because, yes, the average majority for a Labour MP is down. But this is how our system works. Labour have played a blinder, and so did the Liberal Democrats, in working the rules to their advantage. So it's been a very strategic campaign. But now there are massive expectations over delivery. They've boxed themselves in to an extent on taxation, although the majority of people believe that both Labour or the Conservatives in this Parliament, in government, will have to put up taxes somewhere, somehow. So again, I'd say the public aren't going to be completely surprised if some taxes have to go up to pay for things. But bottom line, be bold, do the delivery, because otherwise hedging around is not, he can't govern the way he campaigned in some ways.
On the issue of fairness of the vote, and we've been talking about, they took a third of the seats, got third of the vote, they got 2/3 of the seats and so on. Do you think that is going to matter to anybody? Because the Greens, the Liberal Democrats and also Reform, Nigel Farage's party, are going to make a big deal of this. Will they get any traction?
To be honest, not really. I mean, I've never, Nigel Farage did manage to get the country to have a Brexit vote, or was a very important part of that. So I am absolutely fascinated to see Nigel Farage suddenly a big person for PR. And, maybe in a few decades, because it did take 30 years or so, we will get PR. But no, I think we had a referendum a decade or so ago. We voted against it. I think this will rapidly disappear.
Okay. Just before we go back to our panel, what's going to happen in France tonight? I know you're dealing with that.
We're a French company, and I spend half my time in Paris. It looks very likely that there's going to just be a little bit of political chaos. So we'll have unusually strong and stable government in Britain, and there will be chaos in France.
Bronwyn, that makes sense to you?
I'm not sure you can have a little bit of chaos, but yes, that is exactly what it looks like.
Tom, what did you make of Ben's analysis that actually, essentially, if Labour wants a second term, it's going to have to be, the word is bold. Peter Mandelton said to me a few months ago, bold also can mean stupid. But let's say they've got to strike out with some less caution than they displayed in the campaign.
Well, it's a truism, isn't it, that you're never more powerful than when you've just been elected. But it's also something that I've noticed about Keir Starmer, is he will generally start out by doing the obvious straightforward thing and then become progressively more radical for pragmatic reasons. So he may need to slightly change his style, because I think one of the things that's missing at the moment is a kind of narrative arc around the change that Labour need to make. The article, the academic article that are all circulating these aids at the moment, is one titled, an edifying title, The Death of Deliverism, by a guy called Ben Stoller in America. And this says that many of the great things that Biden's administration has done in America hasn't delivered politically to him in terms of getting sort of more votes. He's not showing change in real people's lives, even though there's statistics saying he's done lots of great things. So how do you get a narrative which connects some of the technocratic stuff, some of the good things that you're doing, to a sense of greater happiness and well-being among voters? And that's really difficult to do, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Ben, I'm going to come back and ask you what the big signal of boldness would be. But Fraser, what do you reckon?
Well, NHS reform will be the obvious opportunity. Even welfare reform, easily the biggest problem in Britain. If Liz Kendall has got the courage to take that on, we might have fewer than 5.5 million people on out-of-work benefits that we do right now. That will show that Labour radicalism was brave enough to do two things the Tories couldn't, because they felt they lacked permission, as it were. They felt Tories would never really be trusted to reform the NHS, and they didn't have a time or the courage to reform welfare again. Now, Rishi Sunak, I disagree, by the way, about deliverism. I think if Rishi Sunak had been able to stand up in this election and point to things that he had delivered, he'd have a much easier time. He was saying in his January 23 speech, either I'm delivering for you or I'm not. And he gave 5 pledges, 5 tests, and failed 4 of them. Now, if he had been able to point to things he was genuinely doing, he might have been able to say, look, you might not like me very much, but look at the results. Look at how I'm delivering. The complete absence of anything and these imagined things that he was claiming Labour were going to do made his whole campaign look ridiculous. So I think this is Starmer's major opportunity to dare where the Tories did not dare.
Ben, you've covered this and you've followed this for a long, long time. But one of the things that seemed to me important about what Fraser said was that Rishi Sunak could have said, I've delivered this, but there's a sense that people had stopped listening to the Tories some time ago.
Yes, at some point, and we're back to that Callaghan quote from 1979, there comes a time, whatever you do. But I would agree that it's about competence, actually, even more than ideology. So, but that competence has to translate into people, which is the point Tom is making. People have to notice it. And so, making changes in America, which Biden has done, of course, it's not yet at a scale that people feel it. And that is one of the challenges. So the Labour government has got to come in and start making some changes that you notice when you ring your GP, you notice when you go into a hospital, and on house building, you notice that there are now affordable houses or places to rent where you live. Those are massive macro changes. It's going to be every bit as hard as levelling up turned out to be for the Conservatives.
I think Biden has made changes that people are feeling already. The economy is growing at 5%. We're barely growing at all here. And that is leading to confidence in jobs. I think it's the southern border, that very resonant phrase that now hangs over American politics, that has really hurt his chances in this. Plus, in the US, you can do things because they have the dollar. They can borrow apparently without limit at the moment. Someday that will get real. And we saw with Liz Truss what happens if the UK, if a prime minister tries to be the US and borrow an awful lot without having the dollar. But I think here I would say planning and the NHS are the two things that Starmer needs to do, and probably the thing that would get a feeling of growth going, his best chance of getting the growth that Rachel Reeves needs as Chancellor and needs to pay for all the other stuff, is planning. Housing planning and other kinds of planning, infrastructure planning, where infrastructure needs a lot of investment. That is their best hope, I think, an absolutely essential reform.
Tom, Rachel Reeves and others have come in here and said planning's the answer. We're going to appoint more planning officers and so on. But that's not going to cut it, is it? Is he bold enough to do what Prime Minister after Prime Minister failed to do, which is to face down the NIMBYs?
I think he will, and I think this is absolutely essential to get growth, by which otherwise you're going to have to make tax rises or do public spending cuts. So he's going to take some really tough decisions. Lots of people have told me when I was writing my biography, Keir Starmer would make a better Prime Minister than Leader of the Opposition. He's been a very effective Leader of the Opposition. But what it's all about is getting stuff done, and getting some things done rather than pretending you can fix everything all at once is actually the answer to populism. Don't go for a three-word slogan which solve everything. Go for what you can do right now.
Ben, just very quick answer. How long a honeymoon does Keir Starmer have?
6 months. It's
Cool.
tough these days.
Cool. All right. You've heard it here first. After the break, some warm word from the Irish Prime Minister, Simon Harris, about a possible closer relationship with the EU under Keir Starmer.
Brexit has happened. The people of Britain have made that decision. But absolutely, is there space to have a veterinary agreement? Is there space in terms of student mobility? Is there space to work closer together on issues? I think there absolutely is, and I do think there would be a willingness in Europe to have those conversations in due course, should that be the wish of the British government.
They've pushed the protesters further back here. There's around 200 or 300 still remaining.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent.
This van goes onto the streets of Plymouth 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
These facilities at the moment are a lifesaver. It's all we've got.
From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region.
I'm going to have nowhere to live for about 3 or 4 months.
They are coming from the epicentre of what is now a global health pandemic. We were seeing and speaking to young women who were selling themselves right on the high street. Before Brexit, these oysters were being exported to the EU, but the trade stopped overnight.
What's your feeling about the future then?
Blake, you'll be finished, I don't know.
The new Labour government is expected to seek closer ties with the EU, perhaps signing fresh deals in areas like border protection and trade. Indeed, the papers this morning are all full of talk of a potentially closer relationship. The Irish Prime Minister has already spoken to Keir Starmer, and now he's told Sky News there would be an openness in Brussels to any British proposals, and that there is space for things like a veterinary agreement. Our Ireland correspondent Stephen Murphy started by asking Simon Harris about his call for a great reset in Anglo-Irish relations.
I think everybody knows the last number of years have been challenging for a variety of reasons, and your viewers don't need any history lesson, but obviously Brexit did make life challenging in relation to the relationship between the two islands.
How much damage did the Tories do to that?
Look, I don't want to get into kind of personalising it like that, but there was clear policy differences and difficulties and challenges over the last number of years. I had a very good professional relationship with Rishi Sunak. He was always very cordial to deal with. So this, for me, was never about personality.
When you spoke to the new Prime Minister, did you ask him when he's going to scrap the Legacy Act and what it'll be replaced with?
I did not, but I did indicate the willingness of my government to work with the British government and with parties in Northern Ireland in relation to legacy. I welcome the commitments that the incoming British government has given in relation to replacing the Legacy Act.
And presumably you will now, or the Irish state will now drop its case against the United Kingdom over the Legacy Act?
Well, no, I think we need to take this step by step. We obviously have, in fairness, a British Prime Minister who's just about on the door of Downing Street in the last couple of days, new ministers who've only been appointed. I'm very respectful of that reality. I welcome the commitment that the British government has now given in relation to legacy, and let's see where that brings us in the time ahead.
The Conservatives accused your government of hypocrisy on legacy because of the lack of criminal prosecutions here in the Republic of Ireland for Troubles-era crimes. They had a point, didn't they?
No, and you can see why I'm looking for a reset, because I think that sort of inflammatory language doesn't help at all. Everybody knows that we went through an extraordinarily difficult time on the island of Ireland. Everybody knows the pain that the Troubles and terrorism brought to people from a whole variety of communities and backgrounds.
Do you think this new government will feel more protective of the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement, given Labour's role and Tony Blair's role in negotiating it?
Well, I think there's no doubt that members of the incoming British government have a very good sense of Northern Ireland. Indeed, the British Prime Minister himself very familiar with Northern Ireland, and I very much welcome the appointment of Hilary Benn as the Northern Ireland Secretary of State, a very experienced, serious politician who again knows Northern Ireland, knows Ireland, and knows the importance of the relationship between the two islands.
And what makes you think that Keir Starmer and his team, his cabinet, his new government will be any better than what we've seen from London previously? What is it about Keir Starmer that makes you feel this optimism?
Well, look, it's not about me deciding anybody's better than anybody else. It's up to the British people to decide who's in their government. But what I do is take the British Prime Minister at his word. He is a man of integrity. He has won a comprehensive victory in the election. He is now the Prime Minister of our nearest neighbour, and I'm very eager to work with him.
All the main political parties here in Ireland are in favour of a united Ireland, including your own. But Keir Starmer says a referendum on a united Ireland isn't even on the horizon. Would you agree with that?
Well, again, I don't think it's any surprise that the British Prime Minister is a unionist and that the Taoiseach of Ireland wishes there to be a united Ireland in due course. The Good Friday Agreement allows us both have those legitimate differing aspirations, and there's a structure in place to address that. For me, though, the focus and priority isn't on a referendum.
I know you say it's not a priority, but then has the prospect of a border poll moved further away now, do you think, that this new government has come in?
I just don't think it arises currently. I mean, the most important thing here is that we have ministers back at their desks in Northern Ireland and that they get on with the work, and that the British and Irish governments as co-guarantors of the peace process play our role in supporting that too.
Something else Keir Starmer wants to get rid of is the Rwanda policy, and your government recently came out and said it was contributing massively to the number of asylum seekers coming here to the Republic of Ireland, in many cases via Northern Ireland, to try and avoid the potential consequences. Do you welcome him scrapping it? Do you think that will help mitigate the flow of asylum seekers coming here from the United Kingdom?
My view in relation to the migration policy of any country is it's up to any country to decide its migration policy. The legitimate concern that I have, and I'm quite sure the British Prime Minister has, is making sure we protect the common travel area. I mean, we have this unique relationship between our two islands, between our two countries, in terms of the common travel area where people can move freely. And it's so important that the common travel area is always protected from any abuse.
If Keir Starmer, as you clearly hope, proves to be a good friend to Ireland, would you reciprocate by being a strong voice and an ally to the United Kingdom within the European Union? Because we know he wants to have some sort of renegotiation of the trade deal, the post-Brexit deal with the EU. Could you then reciprocate and be a strong voice for the interests of the United Kingdom to your partners in Brussels? Wouldn't that only be fair?
Well, Ireland will always be an ally of Britain having a closer relationship with the European Union. It is obviously important that Britain and the European Union continue to be good neighbours. And it is absolutely in Ireland's interest that we facilitate that in every way we can around any European table. Like, Britain and Ireland share a very similar perspective on many issues. And I absolutely think, should it be the position of the British government in the time ahead that it wishes to improve relations or it wishes to have closer relations in any area where it makes practical sense, of course Ireland will be an ally in that conversation.
Do you think there'll be any willingness from Brussels to renegotiate that deal, though, because it was always a bit of a red line previously? Do you think maybe not the whole agreement, but certain elements within it, perhaps veterinary arrangements, things like that, that may ease the issue of the Irish Sea border? Do you think there's, from your discussions in Brussels, there would be any kind of openness to an approach from Keir Starmer and his government?
I do absolutely think there would be a fair hearing for any proposal that the British government, or indeed that the EU has, about ironing out practical issues in terms of having a relationship that works. You know, Brexit has happened. The people of Britain have made that decision. But absolutely, is there space to have a veterinary agreement? Is there space in terms of student mobility? Is there space to work closer together on issues? I think there absolutely is, and I do think there would be a willingness in Europe to have those conversations in due course, should that be the wish of the British government.
Taoiseach, are you supporting England in the Euros?
I wish England very well in the Euros, and I know we now have a British Prime Minister who is is it fair to call him a fanatical football fan, but certainly a very significant football fan, so I wish England very well. The British-Irish relationship is really strong. And let me say this, politics aside, and the challenges of politics, at the end of the day, we're neighbours, we're friends, in many cases we're family as well. And there's an opportunity now, a real opportunity that we must seize, and that the next generation will never forgive us for if we don't, to press reset, to say, yes, it's been a difficult few years, but you know what? We've so much more in common than divides us. We have so many issues of mutual concern. We are two islands side by side. Let's work together and let's fulfil the promise of the Good Friday Agreement, and a Good Friday Agreement that I know is very much in the DNA of the British Labour Party, and is something that I really, really want to talk to Keir Starmer about.
Coming up, just how bad are things now for the SNP following a devastating set of results on Thursday night? I'll speak to one of the party's leading figures who lost her seat, Joanna Cherry. One of the biggest stories from the election was a devastating result for the SNP. The party is down to single figures of MPs with dozens of seats lost. Scottish Labour took most seats and now has 36 MPs. After the scandals and tumult engulfing the SNP in the last 2 years, a bad result was to be expected. But the scale of the defeat has shocked many. So what happens next? And what does it mean for the independence cause? One of the party's leading figures, Joanna Cherry, lost her seat. And she joins me now. Good morning, Joanna.
Good morning, Trevor.
72 hours ago, the SNP held 48 seats at Westminster. Now you've got 9. What happened?
Well, I mean, I think clearly the story of the night is Labour's landslide, albeit it's achieved on quite a small percentage of the vote, I think about a third of the vote across the UK. Although in fairness to Labour, their vote went up very significantly in Scotland. Personally, in my former constituency of Edinburgh South West, I saw, as soon as the postal votes were opened and as the night progressed, a collapse in the Tory vote, and I could see the Tory vote moving over to Labour. But we also lost SNP votes. And it was difficult to persuade people to vote SNP in this election. Many constituents, or my former constituents, said to me on the doorstep, I would vote for you, Joanna, but I just can't vote SNP this time. And I think 2 things have really happened to the party. First of all, our core support and people who believe passionately in the cause of Scottish independence. And remember, if you ask, opinion polls show regularly that about 50% of people in Scotland support the idea that Scotland should become an independent nation state. But that core support was very disillusioned at the party's failure to progress the cause of independence and failure to take advantage of some of the opportunities that were presented to us during the Brexit saga and also during the Boris Johnson premiership. And on the other hand, there were a lot of people who in the past have voted for us in Scotland who didn't necessarily support independence, but saw us as a strong and competent government at Holyrood.
I was going to ask you.
Yes, competence, and also a party that governed with integrity. And I'm very afraid to say, I'm not ashamed because it's not down to me, but I am afraid to say and ashamed for my party that both our reputation of governing competently and our reputation for integrity, that we are different from what went before, has taken a severe battering in the last couple of years.
Am I right then in saying that you think that the current leadership, which is basic continuity, Nicola Sturgeon, lacks competence and integrity?
No. I think it's not fair to blame the people who were left holding the baby when Nicola Sturgeon suddenly resigned. John Swinney has only been in post, I think, for a couple of months, and most of that time has been taken up with what was an unexpectedly early general election campaign. And if anyone could bring the SNP together and resolve issues, then you might argue it would be John Swinney, because he's so widely respected in the party. I've known John since we were teenagers in the Young Scottish Nationalists in Edinburgh in the late 70s. And he has very widespread support and respect in the party. But if he is to maintain that support, he is going to have to acknowledge the enormity of this setback and address the reasons why it happened.
And can those reasons, to some extent, be summed up in 2 words, Nicola Sturgeon? And does she owe your colleagues, the 38 who lost their seats, and the voters, an apology?
I think she does. I don't think you can ever blame a setback like this on one person. However, Nicola Sturgeon was a very strong leader who brooked no debate and no dissent, as I know to my considerable cost. She ran the party the way that she wanted it. She inherited an incredible legacy from Alex Salmond and after the independence referendum, where although we had lost the independence referendum, we had advanced support for it very considerably. She was re-elected as First Minister in a wave of optimism, as we were, those of us who were elected in 2015, when the SNP got 56 out of the then 59 Scottish seats. And then thereafter, she was presented with a series of opportunities after the Brexit referendum and during particularly the early years of Boris Johnson's premiership before he got his majority in 2019 that ought to have been able to have been exploited to further the cause of independence. And there has been a huge strategic failure to do that. And there has also been a failure to win over those who were as yet unconvinced of the merits of the cause. Now, when the SNP was riding high, it was because we were seen as competent. People started to have more confidence in the idea that Scotland could be a self-governing nation because the SNP had performed competently at Holyrood.
I also get the point that you get the sense that you also think this is also an issue of the character of the Sturgeon government. You, as it were, fell out with her about a number of things, but including the issue of gender recognition and so on. Did you feel that in the end you were basically excluded and shut out of your own party?
Absolutely. I mean, in recent years, I've been associated with being a critic of self-identification, not a critic of trans rights. I myself am a lesbian. I'm a human rights lawyer. Of course, I support human rights for everyone and equality for everyone. What I don't support is the right of any man to self-identify as a woman with next to no safeguards. And my views on that are in line with public opinion in Scotland. But what happened with the Gender Recognition Reform Act in Scotland with the SNP is a microcosm of everything that was wrong with Nicola's leadership. It was an ill-thought-through policy that was never debated or voted for on the floor of the SNP conference. Legitimate concerns were dismissed. Those who had legitimate concerns were demonised, and we failed to take the public with us. That is a microcosm of how she governed. Long before I fell out with Nicola about gender recognition reform, I made myself very unpopular by suggesting that our independent strategy needed to be looked at and discussed. And I felt that she was reversing us very slowly up a blind alley on the independent
Is the
strategy.
outcome of all this, just very briefly, that independence is on the shelf for a while?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think it's important to understand that it seems that support from the SNP has become decoupled from those who support independence. It wasn't a big issue on the doorsteps during the election campaign. But I think it would be foolish for the incoming Labour government, and certainly foolish for incoming new Scottish Labour MPs, to assume that the constitutional question is off the table in Scotland.
By the way, just quick yes or no question. Are you going to be standing for Holyrood next time round?
Well, I'm going to take some time to think about what I'm going to do, so I'm not ruling anything in or out at the moment.
Joanna Cherry, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Back with our panel next.
A tough decision. We normally would not interfere. We would normally absolutely let nature take its course. But we were seeking advice from Osprey experts, and we became aware of this opportunity, a really unique opportunity actually, to translocate these chicks to a conservation programme in Spain, which would bolster the Spanish osprey population. And we waited to see if the father, Louis, would return with more fish and up his game, because normally he catches 4 or 5 fish every day, and he has caught up to 9. So we were getting very concerned when nothing was coming in. And we left it for 24 hours, still nothing. We left it other 24 hours, still nothing, no father. Eventually, he produced 1 fish, which is just simply not enough to keep the family going. The weather, as you can see on the film there, was horrendous, and that makes fishing difficult. We suspect he was ill, and that's why he wasn't able to bring in his normal catch rate. And then, so what we did was we made a tough call. We decided we would kind of hand feed, supplementary feed, for 24 hours to see if the situation would improve, and it didn't. And this happened twice, and eventually we decided to be very pragmatic about it, and we decided this opportunity was too good to waste, and we would get the chicks out of the nest and hand them over in the hope that there would be better chances of survival for them and for the parent birds as well. Yes, what's going to happen? Well, interestingly, we think he's been ill, we think he's been unwell, but actually in the past 24 hours we've seen him back around the nest. We've seen him fetching enormous branches and moving them, which is a good sign. And we've even seen him bring a fish in. So we think he's on the mend. We've also, interestingly, seen another male hovering around the nest, probably trying to interest Dorca, the female, but so far she's not taken any interest whatsoever, and I don't think that she will. So we don't really know what's going to happen with nature. We never ever do. We just kind of have to wait and see. But you can jump online and watch the activity. We've got this marvellous community of people who comment and update people who want to get to know the story a bit better.
Back with our panel, Tom Baldwin, Fraser Nelson and Bronwyn Maddox. Fraser, Joanna Cherry took aim at Nicola Sturgeon there, right?
Yes, those two are famously enemies, especially over the gender issue. But I think a lot of SNP activists realise that incumbency, being in power in Scotland, has really hurt the SNP in the same way it hurt the Conservatives. In the same way, by the way, it's hurting Macron and Joe Biden. I mean, being in power right now means you get hammered at elections. That's a worldwide theme. And I think in Scotland, we've seen a verdict on the SNP's performance, which all of a sudden is not overcome, as it was in the past, by the idea that there's a referendum just around the corner. Nicola Sturgeon did her best to keep her troops warm, to think, just hang with me, guys, in another couple of years, freedom's going to be there. That dream faded, and when it did, you had the SNP's record, which is atrocious.
On their record as
public services. I mean, for the first time in living memory, education in Scotland is worse than in England. The health performance is dreadful. And there are so many things that in government, Scots are absolutely furious about. And that fury is now beginning to express itself in political rebellion.
Bronwyn, Simon Harris seemed quite warm to the idea of a reset of this new government, though there's not much sign that the new government is going to take some radical new position on the EU.
Quite warm captures it exactly, I think. A lot of smiles, a lot of sense of this isn't the party that did Brexit, all right, there's a chance for a bit of a reset. And then everyone rattles out the same list of things, which are frankly quite small. The famous veterinary agreement is basically about foodstuffs. So agreeing that Britain and its continental neighbours are not trying to poison each other with sausages or whatever. But it doesn't amount to an awful lot of trade. Students, all right. But some of the big things, again, like the young people, freedom of movement, that the EU would really like, 18 to 30-year-olds. All these headlines in the Italian press recently of goodbye London, the baristas going home. You know, that's what the EU would like. And you're not seeing a lot of
businesses would like some sort of new negotiation, wouldn't
they would like that. So I think the first thing we're going to hear is actually on defence. We've got the NATO summit next week, and then we've got the European Political Community, big meeting of nearly 50 leaders that Keir Starmer is going to be hosting in Britain. And that's where they'll start to explore these things. But I think we'll hear a lot about defence cooperation, intelligence, cyber cooperation, that kind of thing, because that's easy ground. There is common purpose there.
But not much on the economy. We shouldn't expect much change on trade.
They will try, but the things that they're talking about, which are real, are still comparatively small compared to the benefits that Britain has lost from leaving the EU.
Tom, let me show you all something. Here is, people keep referring to 1997. Let's have a look at what happened in the first 100 days of Tony Blair's administration. First day in office. By the equivalent of tomorrow morning, in fact, we knew this morning that they'd given the Bank of England independent. Big, big deal, which still echoing today. Ban on handguns. Within weeks, ceasefire in Northern Ireland. The point I really want to make is not to sort of make a false and silly comparison, but that aside from the issues of economics, the Blair government took some steps which were, if you like, non-financial to define it. We're not seeing that with this government, are we?
I think you will, and you're right. The things that what all those things have in common is they didn't cost money. We've heard so
by the way,
much
devolution to Scotland, Wales.
Well, I was just going to say that was one of the big early ones, and partial reform of the House of Lords was an early one. Again, not costing money, but it's a constitutional change that stays with us today.
And I think that's important. We've had so much in this election about tax and spend and growth and so on. That's important, but you don't get changes of government very often in this country. This is only the fourth in half a century. And you get a whole lot of new faces with new ideas, and it does electrify Whitehall, Westminster, and beyond. And I think you will see.
Probably we don't know what those ideas are.
I think we do.
It's all a bit opaque still.
I don't think that's true. I think you'll see over the next few days announcements on planning reform, announcements on new workers' rights, announcements on new standards in public life. Standards of public life is one way to bring change, which actually isn't about living standards, it's about changing the way we do politics. And there's something about this team that Keir Starmer's put together, which I think are very different to the governments we've had in recent years. There is not that swaggering entitlement, that arrogance that people saw during the COVID lockdown laws just being broken, the sleaze, the appointments to the House of Lords, the money. This is a group of people who have generally been underestimated most of their life, and they proved people wrong. There's a scrappiness and there's an edge to them. It's true of Keir Starmer, I think it's true of Rachel Reeves, I think it's true of people like Wes Streeting and Bridget Phillips. The amazing backstories here, and that is one of the big dynamics of this government. There is a drive and a desire to prove themselves.
We say that, but is there a danger, Fraser, that all these amazing things that are suddenly going to be revealed in the next 7 days? And put this down to, bitter interviewer who never got anything out of his interviewees. We didn't hear any of this in the campaign. And is there a danger that suddenly, if these things are as radical as you make them out to be, they get unloaded in the public?
About Bank of England
and people say, we didn't vote for that.
We didn't hear about Bank of England independence
that was
in 1997. I mean, well, they have talked about planning reform. They have talked about workers' rights. I mean, it's hiding in plain sight.
No, I do expect there to be a whole bunch of things, but then again, you'd expect it. I mean, I don't think that Keir Starmer genuinely has got no ideas for government, although he didn't really give us any in the campaign. You can rather hope that he does have an agenda which is going to reveal. And by the way, he basically asked for a blank slate from the electorate, and he got that blank slate. He can now write onto that whatever he wants. I'd be rather disappointed if he didn't use this incredible power that he's got.
Yeah, I noticed yesterday he employed what I call the Rose Garden strategy in his speech, saying, you know what, I didn't actually promise you anything except it's going to be tough. And so don't have any expectations. But actually, one thing that is interesting, character of the cabinet. Here's something that really struck me. Now, I'm not a big class warrior, but what's really striking is if you look at the numbers there, obviously Conservatives tend to be more privately educated. But even under Blair and Brown, a third of the cabinet were privately educated. Today, 4%. It's a striking thing, isn't it? Is that going to change the conversation around the table?
I think it's what I've just said about people who have felt sort of underestimated, sometimes looked down upon. Rachel Reeves talks about spending her childhood beating posh boys at chess, right? Bridget Phillips was brought up by a single mother on benefits. Keir Starmer is the most working class leader the Labour Party's had for a generation. Now, does that make a difference in policy? Maybe not, but I think it makes a difference in the character of the government. There is a sense of, this is not a game. This is not something we swagger around Westminster to do. This is something that matters. They want to bring change.
That can be a huge strength to them, but not if it feels like class war.
Okay.
It's not class war.
One quick fun fact for you. There are more people in the POMs now who were in Gordon Brown's cabinet, 5, than were in Boris Johnson's cabinet. Make of that what you will. That's it for us next week. See you next week, 08:30.